Milo dropped his wrench. The heavy iron tool hit the grease-stained floorboards, the sharp clatter echoing loudly in the absolute quiet of his underground repair shop. For a brief moment, the silence returned, thick and suffocating, smelling of old brass polish and cold ash. He did not get a single chance to bend down and pick it up. The reinforced oak door of his hidden workshop splintered inward with a deafening, terrifying crack. A massive figure crashed violently through the ruined wooden frame, bringing the sharp, metallic smell of ozone, burned coal, and fresh blood into the stagnant, oil-heavy air. It was a female orc, towering and incredibly broad, dragging a severed, heavily modified, steam-powered prosthetic arm behind her. The torn hydraulic cables of the heavy limb scraped mercilessly against the uneven stone floor. They spit angry blue sparks that briefly and violently illuminated the dim, dusty corners of the room, casting long, chaotic shadows against the brick walls. She did not stop to scan the dark room or assess the threat level. Her heavy steel-toed boots stumbled blindly, carrying her immense weight directly toward his only clear workbench. She collapsed forward without a single sound. Her broad, heavily scarred chest hit the worn wooden surface with a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the tools on the nearby pegboard. The violent impact of her landing sent his prized rack of fragile glass oil gauges tumbling over the wooden edge. They shattered into hundreds of glittering pieces on the stone tiles. Thick, expensive amber machine oil pooled quickly around the heavy tread of her boots, mixing with the dark droplets falling from her shoulder. Milo took a slow, deliberate step backward. His bad leg twinged slightly, a dull ache reminding him of an old work accident, as he instinctively put physical distance between his fragile human body and the intimidating intruder. He wiped his grease-stained hands on his rough canvas apron, his sharp mind working much faster than his weak limbs ever could. He looked closely at the sparking mechanical limb still gripped tightly in her remaining organic hand. It was a brutal piece of engineering. The arm was built entirely for crushing bone and tearing steel rather than delicate articulation. The thick brass plating was heavily dented, bearing the fresh scorch marks of a violent ambush, while the internal pneumatic pistons hissed weakly, losing pressure by the second. Deep in the thick brass plating of the forearm, he saw it clearly. The burned, jagged insignia of the corrupt city syndicate was seared deeply into the metal. Milo felt a cold knot tighten hard in his stomach, a familiar dread creeping up his spine. He knew the brutal, unforgiving laws of this sprawling, smog-choked city perfectly well. He hid down here in the slums specifically to avoid the Syndicate's heavy-handed cruelty. That specific mark meant she was an enforcer, a ruthless hunter of men. More importantly, it meant immediate, agonizing death for anyone foolish enough to offer her shelter, a bandage, or even a drop of water. The female orc let out a low, ragged breath that sounded exactly like a failing engine compressor struggling to turn. Her green skin was extremely pale under the thick layer of soot and street grime. It heavily contrasted with the clean, bright copper wires jutting wildly from her torn shoulder socket. The physical difference between them was staggering. Milo's hands were small, scarred by tiny burns from a soldering iron, completely unsuited for combat. Her shoulders alone were wider than the doorway she had just destroyed, corded with thick muscle built from years of harsh survival. Milo did not possess any martial skills. He preferred the predictable, quiet logic of gears and pistons over the chaotic, unpredictable violence of people. But he easily recognized the fatal signs of catastrophic pressure loss when he saw it, whether in a cast-iron steam boiler or a living, breathing creature. She was bleeding out quickly, losing vital fluids onto his floorboards. The corrupt syndicate did not just leave their broken tools behind. They hunted them down relentlessly to ensure the scrap was permanently melted. If they tracked her here, his hidden shop would become a tomb for them both. He stood frozen in the dim, flickering light of his hidden workshop, listening to the erratic hissing of her severed steam lines. The rational, survival-driven part of his brain screamed at him to run out the back alley, lock the heavy iron grate, and leave her to die alone in the dark. Helping a marked Syndicate outcast was pure suicide. Yet, as he watched her massive, intimidating frame shudder vulnerably on his workbench, a different instinct flared up inside him. A mechanic does not look away from a broken mechanism, no matter how dangerous the machine is. You do not throw away broken things if you can rebuild them. He slowly reached up, his grease-stained fingers pulling his thick leather welding goggles down over his eyes to protect them from the harsh blue sparks. He stepped straight into the pooling amber oil, drawing closer to the sparking, forbidden machinery, bracing himself as her heavy, calloused fingers suddenly twitched toward the grip of her pistol. The heavy metallic click of a gun hammer cut sharply through the hissing mist. Vara aimed a heavy, scuffed pistol directly at Milo's chest, the wide iron barrel leveled steadily at his heart. The weapon was a brutal military model, its grip wrapped in blood-stained leather, carrying the violent history of countless close-quarters executions. From the jagged stump of her shoulder, her severed hydraulic lines were violently spraying scalding steam. The searing white vapor hissed angrily against the damp air of the cellar, cooking the exposed green flesh of her neck. It was actively burning her own skin, causing her massive hand to shake with uncontrollable muscle spasms. The acrid smell of burning meat mixed sickeningly with the sharp metallic tang of spilled amber oil. She glared at him through the thick, swirling vapor. Her yellow eyes were narrowed, completely wild like a cornered arena beast expecting the final, fatal blow. "Fix the arm, gear boy, or you're my next bounty," she snarled. It was a harsh, gravelly sound, scraping from a throat choked with soot and exhaustion. Her voice carried the distinct, heavy accent of the outer fighting pits, a place where weakness was instantly punished by death. The threat hung heavy in the stagnant air of the underground repair shop. Milo stood perfectly still, fully aware that a single twitch of her massive, calloused finger would tear a hole the size of a teacup straight through his fragile ribs. The physical contrast between them was terrifying. She was a towering monument of muscle and violence, while he was a small, crippled mechanic, armed only with grease-stained rags. Yet the cold logic of the situation quickly overrode his fragile human panic. He clinically ignored the massive pistol aimed at his heart. Milo calmly reached up with his oil-stained fingers, pulling down his thick leather welding goggles to shield his sensitive eyes. The dark, scratch-covered glass instantly filtered out the blinding blue sparks erupting from her ruined shoulder socket. Through the tinted lenses, she ceased to be an intimidating, lethal Syndicate enforcer. She simply became a complex, critically failing mechanism that desperately needed immediate calibration. He let out a quiet, tired sigh, the sound barely audible over the loud, erratic hissing of her leaking pneumatic valves. He stepped forward, the broken glass from his shattered oil gauges crunching softly beneath his worn leather boots. He leaned in dangerously close to the scuffed iron barrel of her pistol to inspect the damaged brass gears of the severed limb resting on his workbench. The intricate cogs were completely fused together by immense heat, the delicate copper wiring melted into useless slag. He recognized the brutal, efficient design immediately. These Syndicate prosthetics were engineered purely for maximizing kinetic output and crushing force, completely ignoring the painful strain they placed on the host's biological nervous system. The heavy brass plating was thick enough to stop a crossbow bolt, but the internal pressure regulators were notoriously fragile if struck from behind. She had been ambushed by professionals who knew exactly where to hit an enforcer. "Your primary pressure manifold is completely blown," Milo stated dryly, his conversational tone sounding remarkably flat against the immediate threat of death. He did not raise his hands in surrender, nor did he beg for his miserable life. He simply stated a mechanical fact. "You are losing core steam pressure by the second. If you shoot me, you will bleed out on my floorboards in exactly 3 minutes." He watched her closely, waiting for the harsh reality of her failing biology to penetrate her warrior's adrenaline. She possessed the sheer brawn to tear his head off, but he possessed the vital intellect and specialized tools required to keep her alive. He needed her to understand this delicate synergy, or they would both simply rot in this forgotten basement. Vera ground her blunt, heavy teeth together, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet shop. The heavy pistol wavered slightly in her grip as another violent burst of boiling steam erupted from her severed hydraulic tubes, searing a fresh, angry red burn across her collarbone. She did not scream. She only let out a low, dangerous growl, desperately fighting her own failing nervous system. Her cultural code demanded cruelty. Her brutal traditions dictated that any human in the slums would gladly sell her out to the Syndicate executioners for a handful of copper coins. She fully expected betrayal. Surrendering control to a weak, unremarkable human male went against every instinct forged in the unforgiving gladiator arenas. Milo remained motionless, allowing her the necessary time to process her internal struggle. He knew she had to choose trust over her deeply ingrained suspicion. He slowly raised his small, grease-stained left hand, purposefully keeping it empty and visible in the dim light. "Put the iron down," he said quietly, a melancholic weariness coloring his voice. "Let me clamp those bleeding lines before the steam cooks your remaining nerves." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic, dying hiss of the broken machinery. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive female orc lowered her trembling arm. The heavy iron pistol hit the scarred wooden workbench with a dull, final thud. She surrendered, her broad shoulders slumping as the last of her aggressive adrenaline finally evaporated into the cold air. Milo immediately reached for a rusted iron clamp, his small fingers moving with practiced, frantic speed. But as he gripped the heavy tool, the main pressure valve inside her severed arm let out a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. The remaining steam reserve was going into critical overload, threatening to detonate the heavy brass casing right in their unprotected faces. Heavy thudding shook the reinforced iron grate covering the alleyway entrance. Syndicate executioners strictly utilized heavy iron battering rams, and the rhythmic, deafening boom meant they had finally arrived. Fine red brick dust rained down from the vaulted ceiling, dusting the shattered glass and spilled amber oil on the floor. Milo wiped cold sweat from his pale forehead, his mind rapidly calculating the structural integrity of the old rusty hinges upstairs. The Syndicate did not employ regular city guards. They sent heavily armored killers carrying steel-tipped bolts and short blades. They possessed exactly 2 minutes before the barricade gave way entirely. The deep, violent vibrations rattled the surviving wrenches hanging loosely on his wooden pegboard. He turned his back on the sealed stairs, focusing entirely on the broken machinery bleeding out on his workbench. Milo grabbed a heavily rusted soldering iron from the chaotic pile of metal scraps. He simultaneously snatched a heavy spool of thick, uninsulated copper wire, his small fingers working with practiced, frantic speed. The crude soldering tool hissed as he forcefully pumped the tiny pedal bellows under the desk, heating the iron tip until it glowed a dull, angry orange. This tool was a salvaged relic from the old factory districts, heavy and poorly balanced for delicate work. He did not possess the luxury of applying gentle anesthetics or using delicate brass tweezers. Survival in the slums demanded blunt, immediate action over clean aesthetics. He stepped close to the massive female orc, the ambient heat of her feverish green skin radiating against his grease-stained canvas apron. The damaged metal arm suddenly twitched hard on its own, driven by misfiring internal pressure regulators. Thick, internal gears ground against each other with a sickening metallic screech, throwing fresh sparks onto the damp stone floor. The upward jerk nearly threw Milo backward into his tool racks. He quickly scrambled forward, throwing his narrow chest directly over the thick brass plating. He was forced to use his entire body weight just to hold her thick, scarred wrist down against the splintered wood. His weak left leg braced hard against the uneven floorboards, the old, deep injury in his knee aching sharply under the sudden strain. The sheer physical density of her muscle under his fragile ribs felt exactly like leaning against a living, breathing boulder. Vara groaned, her massive frame shuddering violently as the hot solder dripped dangerously close to her exposed biological veins. She bared her flat, heavy teeth and spat a harsh, guttural word, openly cursing his rough, unpolished methods. Her deep, gravelly voice vibrated directly into his collarbone, demanding the clean precision of an upper-city artificer rather than this brutal butchery. She expected the sting of betrayal, not the burning pinch of a makeshift repair. Milo simply gritted his teeth, completely ignoring the insult to his craftsmanship. He wrapped the thick copper wire tightly around the spewing hydraulic valve with a pair of heavy iron pliers. The sharp smell of melting rosin and scorched metal grew suffocating in the unventilated room, burning his eyes beneath the dark goggles. He twisted the copper strands hard, manually forcing the severed brass lips back together to seal the catastrophic leak. The searing white steam finally ceased its aggressive hissing, replaced by a low, stable hum of contained boiler pressure. The crude fix held tight, bridging the gap between dead metal and living tissue. Milo kept his weight pressed against her arm for 3 long breaths, his chest rising and falling rapidly from the sheer physical exertion. He felt the terrifying, erratic pulse of her biological veins slowly synchronize with the mechanical hum of the stabilized prosthetic. His small, burned fingers rested briefly against the cold, jagged branding scars on her bicep. The marks told a grim story of survival in the underground fighting pits, a life measured only in spilled blood and broken bones. A mechanic fixes the broken machine, but the true craft lies in making the living host accept the crude iron patch. Above them, the alleyway grate groaned with a horrific tearing sound of stressed steel. The massive battering ram struck the door again, the heavy thud echoing like a final death knell in the small underground room. The rusty hinges sheared off with a sharp, distinct crack, the sound cutting cleanly through the lingering oil smoke. Heavy, armored boots immediately began stomping down the narrow wooden stairs, bringing the distinct metallic clatter of drawn weapons. Milo locked the final wire into place and looked down into the yellow, predatory eyes of the female orc, silently offering her the repaired limb. The heavy iron boots stomped down the wooden stairs, bringing the distinct metallic clatter of drawn weapons. A volley of steel-tipped crossbow bolts shattered the remaining glass of the workshop door, thudding viciously into the heavy oak workbench. Milo dropped to his bad knee, the sudden movement sending a sharp flare of familiar agony up his thigh. He scrambled instinctively behind a pile of rusted iron boiler plates, his breath catching painfully in his narrow chest. He expected the massive orc to draw her scuffed pistol and make a final, bloody stand against the Syndicate executioners. Instead, Vara completely ignored the armed killers pouring into the confined room. She turned her broad, heavily scarred back to the splintered doorway and faced the solid brick wall of his cellar. She raised her newly repaired mechanical arm, the thick brass plating gleaming dully in the dim light. The crude copper wires Milo had just twisted into place hummed with raw, unstable thermal energy. The pneumatic piston inside the thick forearm contracted with a violent, deafening hiss of pressurized steam. Vara drove her massive steel fist directly into the ancient masonry with the devastating force of a runaway train. The impact sounded like a cannon shot going off inside the tiny underground room. 3 layers of load-bearing red brick instantly exploded outward, completely failing to resist the sheer kinetic output of the crude Syndicate prosthetic. A massive cloud of choking, pulverized mortar immediately filled the stagnant air, completely blinding the charging executioners. Thick, blinding red dust coated everything, stinging Milo's unprotected eyes beneath his pushed-up welding goggles. He coughed violently, tasting the bitter, chalky grit of centuries-old slum foundations on his tongue. Before he could even attempt to stand on his aching leg, a colossal green hand shot out through the swirling debris. Vara grabbed the thick canvas of his heavy work apron, her blunt, calloused fingers twisting the fabric into a tight knot. She lifted him effortlessly off the stone floor with a single, brutal heave, completely bypassing his weak limbs. He hung helplessly in the air for a terrifying second, his boots dangling entirely off the ground, a fragile bag of bones caught in the grip of an apex predator. She did not ask for his permission or formulate a complex escape plan. She simply dragged him violently through the jagged, smoking hole she had just created in the cellar wall. The rough, broken edges of the shattered bricks tore deeply into the sleeves of his cotton shirt, scraping his pale skin as she pulled him into the hidden smuggler's tunnel next door. This narrow passage opened directly into a damp, forgotten side alley, where a stolen, half-repaired steam cart sat waiting in the shadows. It was a heavy, rusted smuggling vehicle, built wide and low to the ground, smelling strongly of stale coal and neglected maintenance. Vera hurled Milo unceremoniously into the driver's seat, his small frame bouncing hard against the cracked leather upholstery. "Drive, or I throw you off!" she roared over the chaotic din of the crumbling wall. Her gravelly voice was raw with adrenaline, her yellow eyes scanning the dark alleyway for movement. She vaulted into the iron-plated cargo bed of the cart, the suspension groaning dangerously under her immense, dense weight. The physical reality of their situation was brutally simple. She provided the raw, destructive muscle to break the cage, but she relied entirely on his specialized intellect to operate the complex machinery of their escape. If he failed to start the cold boiler, the heavy armored killers pouring through the wall would butcher them both in the dirt. Milo did not waste breath arguing. He scrambled desperately forward, his grease-stained hands slipping frantically over the cold, unfamiliar brass control levers. The cart did not possess a standard ignition key. It was a patchwork monstrosity of stolen parts that required a delicate sequence of manual overrides to start. He ripped the protective metal casing off the primary steering column, exposing a tangled rat's nest of frayed ignition wires. His small, burned fingers moved purely on muscle memory, ignoring the terrifying, loud thuds of heavy crossbow bolts suddenly striking the thick wooden frame of the cart. The Syndicate assassins had reached the hole in the wall, their weapons finding the range. One steel-tipped bolt punched completely through the wooden dashboard, stopping a mere inch from Milo's trembling left knee. He stared at the vibrating iron shaft for a fraction of a second, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The cold reality of his own fragility threatened to paralyze his thoughts. He forced himself to look away, focusing entirely on the exposed copper ignition lines. He stripped the rubber coating with his thumbnail, twisting the sparking ends together with a practiced, desperate twist. The cold boiler coughed harshly, spitting a thick cloud of black, oily smoke from the rusted exhaust pipe. The heavy pistons groaned, fighting the inertia of the cold iron block, before finally catching with a loud, rhythmic, thumping sequence. He slammed his palm hard against the primary steam release valve, flooding the engine block with critical pressure. The heavy smuggling cart lurched forward violently, its iron-banded wooden wheels tearing deep, angry gouges into the damp cobblestones. They smashed aggressively through the rotting wooden barricades blocking the alley exit, bursting out into the smog-choked streets of the lower slums. The cold night air rushed over Milo's sweat-drenched face, carrying the sharp chemical stench of the distant factory districts. Sometimes, survival does not belong to the strongest predator, but simply to the one who knows exactly which fragile wire to cross in the dark. The steam cart violently shuddered. It ground to a harsh, violent halt in the middle of a deadly desert made entirely of rusted shrapnel. These were the dreaded rust wastes, a desolate graveyard of decommissioned war machines left over from a forgotten conflict. Huge skeletal remains of iron dreadnoughts jutted from the dunes like the ribs of dead metal leviathans. The heavy iron wheels of their stolen vehicle sank deeply into the loose, abrasive iron sand. A thick, suffocating plume of black smoke erupted violently from beneath the front hood. The overworked, patchwork engine had finally overheated, filling the stagnant air with the sharp, sickening smell of burning oil. Milo dropped his heavy head against the cracked leather steering wheel. He let out a long, ragged exhale, his weak lungs burning terribly from the toxic chemical fumes. The scorching desert sun baked the cart's metal body without a single ounce of mercy. The iron dashboard radiated an intense, dry heat that blistered Milo's bare hands the moment he touched the surface. He slowly pushed his exhausted frame upward, his bad leg aching with a deep, familiar throb from the incredibly bumpy ride. He popped the heavy, rusted latches of the engine compartment with grease-stained fingers, coughing as a fresh wave of scalding steam washed over his pale face. The silence of the rust wastes was absolute and terrifying. It was not a natural quiet, but the heavy, dead stillness of a place where nothing biological was ever meant to survive. He wiped a thick layer of oily grime from the main pressure gauge, his thumb leaving a clean streak across the cracked glass dial. This smuggling cart had clearly seen decades of hard abuse, its wooden frame deeply scarred by weapon impacts and crude repairs. It was a dying machine, held together entirely by his stubborn willpower and a few spools of copper wire. The sheer physical contrast between the two runaways remained completely staggering in the harsh, unforgiving daylight. Vara sat in the back, possessing the raw, terrifying strength to lift the entire cast-iron engine block out of the chassis with one hand. Yet brutal physical power was completely useless against the microscopic, abrasive debris clogging the engine. Milo carefully extracted a tiny, soft-bristled brush from his canvas pouch, a tool usually reserved for fine pocket watches. He meticulously cleaned the iron sand out of the delicate carburetor, sweeping the microscopic grit away from the fragile brass valves. Vara kept her yellow eyes fixed on the horizon, her newly repaired mechanical arm resting heavily on her knee. The crude copper wiring Milo had hastily installed hummed softly against her green skin. It was an alien sensation, lacking the polished, synchronized grace of her original Syndicate cybernetics, yet it functioned with brutal reliability. She watched the frail human working diligently over the steaming boiler, unable to comprehend his bizarre lack of self-preservation. By all the harsh laws of the city, he should have abandoned her bleeding body to the executioners. Instead, he was currently baking alive in a deadly wasteland, meticulously cleaning a fragile mechanism just to keep her moving. "We are sitting targets out here, human," Vara growled loudly from the cargo bed. Her deep voice was incredibly tense, carrying the heavy, paranoid weight of a hunted gladiator who knew the smell of an impending ambush. "The Syndicate hounds will see that oily smoke for miles across this flat wasteland." She checked the spinning cylinder of her scuffed pistol, the heavy metallic clicks sounding remarkably loud in the dead quiet. Milo wiped salty sweat from his stinging eyes, immensely careful not to drop his tiny, vital tool into the grease. "One grain of this iron sand will completely seize the intake manifold, and we will walk the rest of the way," he replied quietly. Vera watched his painstaking, agonizingly slow work in absolute silence. In the brutal underground fighting pits, a broken weapon was instantly discarded for a sharper blade. Here, this fragile mechanic was saving their only lifeline with a tool smaller than her pinky finger. She shifted her immense weight, purposefully positioning her broad, scarred back between the blinding sun and his stooped, vulnerable shoulders. It was a tiny, gruff gesture of protection that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. Sometimes, the most impenetrable armor a person can wear is simply a shadow freely given by an unexpected companion. Milo tightened the final brass screw on the carburetor housing, praying to the forgotten gods of gears. He slowly reached for the heavy ignition lever, his blistered hand shaking from the lingering adrenaline and severe dehydration. The engine sputtered weakly, coughed out a final puff of gray smoke, and finally settled into a steady, rhythmic mechanical thrum. He slumped back into the cracked leather driver's seat, allowing himself exactly 1 second of immense relief. That single second of peace was instantly shattered. A terrifying, unnatural, mechanical rumble echoed suddenly from the jagged dunes directly behind them, vibrating through the cart's wooden floorboards. Night fell rapidly over the rust wastes. The freezing air instantly replaced the suffocating heat of the desert day. Milo struck a heavy flint against a rusted steel plate. He set up a small fire using oily rags, the resulting flames casting erratic shadows across the iron graveyard. The sharp smell of burning grease easily masked the metallic scent of the surrounding sand. They needed to rest, but the makeshift repairs on the female orc's limb required immediate recalibration before the cold seized the metal completely. Vara sat quietly on the frozen ground. Her immense frame effortlessly blocked the cutting wind from extinguishing their fragile heat source. Milo moved close to her scarred shoulder, his weak knee throbbing painfully in the dropping temperature. The dim, flickering light made it incredibly difficult for Milo to see the intricate mechanisms he had hastily installed during their escape. The erratic shadows danced confusingly over the jagged, raised tissue of her past. He pulled a specialized tool from his canvas pouch to begin the necessary work. He used precise brass calipers to carefully measure the misaligned gears in Vara's reconstructed shoulder. He leaned in closely, positioning the cold metal tips around the primary housing. The thick muscles beneath her green skin suddenly tensed like coiled springs. This abrupt movement threw the delicate instrument completely out of alignment. The sheer physical density of her brawn constantly reminded him of his own profound fragility. He sighed quietly, the melancholic sound instantly swallowed by the vast desert silence. He quietly asked her to stop flexing her muscles because it threw off his delicate measurements. His voice was raspy from breathing toxic smoke, yet it carried no fear. Vara grunted softly, an instinctual reaction forged deeply in the underground fighting pits. Relaxing your guard in the arena usually meant an agonizing death. Her yellow eyes remained fixed on the dark horizon, her mind constantly anticipating an ambush. Slowly, with immense internal effort, she forced her broad back to soften. It was a terrifying surrender of control for a former Syndicate enforcer. She allowed the fragile human mechanic to probe the highly vulnerable junction between her biological flesh and the crude copper wiring. Milo adjusted a tiny tension screw, his frozen fingers feeling incredibly clumsy. He felt the powerful, steady rhythm of her pulse physically matching the low hum of the repaired piston. Trust is never given instantly in a broken world. It is built slowly, one measured turn of a wrench at a time. He wiped black soot from his pale brow, finally satisfied with the gear alignment. He reached out to test the joint's downward rotation. Suddenly, the oily flames flickered violently. A distinct, heavy, metallic snap echoed clearly from the unseen dunes lying just beyond their camp. Milo froze, his hands hovering. The heavy, metallic snap from the dark dunes shattered the quiet intimacy of their makeshift camp. He held his breath, expecting the terrifying silhouette of a Syndicate pursuit train to crest the rusted horizon. Seconds ticked by, measured only by the erratic popping of their oily fire and the distant howl of the desert wind. Nothing moved in the freezing darkness. It was likely just shifting iron sand settling over a buried dreadnought chassis, cooling and contracting in the freezing night air. He let out a long exhale, a cloud of white vapor pluming from his chapped lips. He returned his focus to the massive green arm resting heavily across her knee. The physical contrast between them was undeniably stark in the flickering firelight. Milo's hands were remarkably small, the pale skin perpetually stained with dark machine oil and scored by tiny burns. He carefully threaded a microscopic iron screw into the base of her pneumatic piston. Right next to his fragile fingertips lay the brutal, thick musculature of her green arm. Her arm was a terrifying monument to absolute kinetic violence, corded with dense strength. She could snap his wrists with the same casual effort he used to snap a dry twig. As he wiped a smear of excess grease from the brass plating, his thumb brushed against a series of deep, jagged branding scars cut directly into her bicep. These were not the unpredictable marks of a street brawl or a shrapnel burst. They were deliberate, cruel brands. Milo recognized the overlapping, blistered rings of the underground fighting pits, a brutal signature marking her past as an arena slave before she ever became an enforcer. Before she wore the dreaded insignia, she had been a disposable piece of meat, forced to butcher others simply to earn a single cup of muddy water. The city took broken people and forged them into monsters. They burn deep, do they not? Vara spoke suddenly, her yellow eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Her voice was a low, gravelly rumble, completely devoid of self-pity. It was simply a cold statement of fact, carrying the heavy exhaustion of a life measured entirely in inflicted pain. The slave masters used white-hot iron. They believed a marked beast fights twice as hard to avoid the branding iron a second time. She did not pull her massive arm away from his delicate touch. She simply watched his reaction, testing the human's threshold for the ugly truth of her past. Milo did not offer hollow words of pity or sweeping apologies for the cruelty of his species. He simply lowered his brass calipers, the cold metal clinking softly against the rusted terrain. "The city treats everything like cheap, disposable scrap," he replied quietly, his voice laced with a deep fatigue. "If a gear strips, they melt it down. If a person breaks, they throw them into the fighting pits. It is a highly inefficient system." He gently wiped a stray flake of soot from the edge of her deepest scar with a clean corner of his canvas apron. He picked up his tiny screwdriver again, returning to the slow work of securing the copper relays. "I prefer a different methodology," he stated simply, locking the final tension spring into place with a satisfying, microscopic click. "You repair the damaged housing, reinforce the stress points, and the mechanism runs stronger than it did off the factory floor." The massive female orc fell completely silent, processing the strange concept of being treated as something worth repairing rather than destroying. A broken mechanism only regains its true value when someone chooses to invest the time to fix it. Vara stared at the fragile human mechanic for a long, heavy moment. The freezing wind howled through the skeletal remains of the rusted dreadnoughts, but the air immediately between them felt suddenly dense. She reached up with her remaining organic hand, her thick fingers tracing the heavy brass pain inhibitor locked tightly around the back of her thick neck. It was a brutal piece of Syndicate technology that kept her sane during massive physical trauma. "The patch holds, human," she growled slowly, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "But the deep interface is fried. To fix the internal pressure lag, you must access the main spinal port." Vara reached behind her neck. Her thick, calloused fingers dug deeply into the heavily scarred flesh located just below the base of her skull. She gripped the cold, heavy brass pain inhibitor locked tightly into her upper spine. The metal was permanently stained with old, dried blood and the dark grime of the lower city slums. With a single, brutal twist of her wrist, she unclasped the restrictive device with a loud, metallic click. The heavy iron mechanism fell heavily onto the frozen iron sand beneath them, burying itself in the abrasive red dirt. The sudden removal of the dampening field was immediately, viscerally devastating. Without the heavy inhibitor suppressing her natural sensory inputs, the freezing night air hit her completely exposed nervous system port. Vara visibly winced, a harsh, ragged hiss escaping her clenched, heavy teeth. Her entire massive body tensed instantly, the dense muscles of her broad back cording like thick, coiled iron cables beneath her green skin. The raw, unfiltered sensation of the icy wind blowing directly against her raw nerve endings was pure, sudden agony. She had not felt the true, biting temperature of the world in many long, bloody years. Milo swallowed hard, tasting the bitter, oily ash blowing from their small campfire into his dry mouth. He stared intently at the glowing, biomechanical port embedded deeply within her thick flesh. The intricate, microscopic copper nodes were severely inflamed, leaking tiny, clear drops of spinal fluid that hissed faintly against the hot brass collar. It was a terrifying physical testament to the corrupt city syndicate's incredibly cruel efficiency. The brutal overseers surgically removed a warrior's natural pain response to create a completely fearless, unstoppable asset for the violent city patrols. They effectively turned living, breathing people into numb, obedient siege engines, incapable of feeling their own bodies breaking apart. To freely surrender this specific, critical vulnerability to an unremarkable stranger was an act of complete madness in the cutthroat lower slums. Trust was a rare, foreign currency she had never possessed in the underground fighting pits. Yet, Vara slowly lowered her massive, heavy head, exposing the raw, pulsing circuitry completely to the frail human mechanic. Her yellow, predatory eyes remained fixed firmly on the dark, empty dunes of the sprawling, rusted wastes. "One wrong wire, human, and I'm completely paralyzed," she stated quietly. Her deep, gravelly voice did not tremble in the cold air, carrying only the fatalistic, exhausted calm of a veteran gladiator facing the final, bloody round of a tournament. She fully understood the absolute finality of her dangerous choice. "I am aware of the biological stakes," Milo replied slowly, his voice raspy from inhaling the toxic chemical dust of the desert. He knelt closer to her kneeling form, his bad knee throbbing intensely against the hard, frozen earth. He pulled a microscopic set of brass tweezers from his canvas tool roll, the small metal instrument catching the dim, orange light of their dying fire. His pale, grease-stained hands trembled slightly as he began the delicate, terrifying procedure. The sheer physical proximity to her immense, coiled strength made his own frail mortality acutely obvious. He could clearly smell the sharp scent of ozone and dried sweat clinging to her thick leather armor. If his small, scarred hand slipped by a single microscopic millimeter, she would instantly become a permanent, breathing statue trapped forever in the freezing desert. He forced his erratic, shallow breathing to slow down, matching the steady, rhythmic hissing of their oily campfire. The dim, flickering orange light cast long, chaotic shadows across the exposed biological nerves, making the microscopic work incredibly difficult. He needed to manually bypass the fried internal relay without triggering a catastrophic biological rejection from her massive spinal cord. He gently probed the outer casing of the spinal port, testing the structural integrity of the surrounding hardened scar tissue with his tiny metal tool. The massive female orc let out a low, involuntary growl as the cold steel touched her raw, unshielded nerves. The deep, rumbling sound vibrated powerfully through the frozen ground, rattling the small metal tools scattered on his canvas roll. "Keep breathing. Focus on the fire," Milo whispered softly, focusing entirely on the tiny, damaged copper filaments. He used his left hand to gently brace her thick, muscular neck, his small fingers looking utterly fragile against her dark green skin. The immense, feverish heat radiating from her solid, powerful body contrasted sharply with the freezing night wind cutting across his own narrow, hunched shoulders. It was a profound, undeniable physical contrast. The massive, violent warrior, willfully submitting to the careful, hesitant touch of a broken mechanic. He carefully clamped a tiny, insulated grounding wire onto the jagged edge of the hot brass port. He needed to securely reroute the primary pressure signal directly from the heavy mechanical arm into her biological nervous system. Vara clenched her remaining organic fist, driving her blunt, dirty fingernails deeply into her own calloused palm. The intense physical agony of the unregulated, raw neural connection was clearly tearing through her massive frame, testing her immense endurance. A single drop of dark, heavy sweat rolled down her sharp, scarred jawline, dropping silently onto the frozen, iron-rich sand. Yet she remained completely stationary, anchoring her heavy steel-toed boots to the frozen ground like a massive stone statue. She actively chose to trust his small, trembling hands over her deeply ingrained, survival-driven instincts of sudden violence and isolation. It was a quiet, desperate alliance forged in the absolute darkest corner of a forgotten, rusted wasteland. Milo successfully bridged the microscopic gap, twisting the final tiny strand of copper firmly into place. A sudden, sharp hiss of highly pressurized steam erupted directly from her reconstructed shoulder joint. The heavily repaired mechanical limb twitched violently on its own accord, the heavy brass fingers flexing and locking with terrifying, renewed strength. The vital connection was fully restored, marrying dead steel to living, breathing tissue once again. A quiet, exhausted sigh of immense relief escaped Milo's chapped, dry lips. He slowly leaned back, wiping cold, nervous sweat from his pale forehead, entirely unaware of the massive, unnatural shadow slowly rising from the jagged sand dune directly behind his fragile back. Milo tore the iron free. He scavenged a heavy pneumatic piston directly from the jagged wreckage of an old military dreadnought. The colossal, rusted war machine lay half-buried in the freezing, abrasive sand, serving as a dead monument to a forgotten border conflict. His narrow, fragile chest heaved violently as he dragged the incredibly dense metal cylinder back toward their dying campfire. The brutal, freezing desert wind howled through the skeletal ribs of the surrounding iron leviathans, biting deeply through his thin, cotton shirt. Every single step sent a fresh wave of blinding pain shooting straight up from his ruined knee. He dropped the heavy salvaged part directly into the dirt beside Vara, the heavy impact kicking up a small cloud of red dust. The massive female orc sat perfectly still in the flickering orange light, her breathing slow and measured. She watched his agonizing physical struggle with her intense yellow eyes, her newly repaired nervous system port completely exposed to the harsh elements. "That piston is designed entirely for a siege engine, human," she stated quietly, her deep voice cutting cleanly through the whistling wind. It will completely shatter my biological collarbone the exact moment I trigger the primary release valve. Milo simply wiped a thick mixture of cold sweat and black grease from his pale forehead. I am actively adjusting the internal pressure differentials to match your specific biological density, he replied wearily, pulling a heavy iron welding torch from his canvas bag. The Syndicate built your original prosthetic strictly for fast execution, entirely sacrificing heavy structural integrity for quick strikes. He knelt closely beside her massive, scarred thigh, igniting the crude acetylene torch with a sharp, bright hiss. A blinding blue flame erupted instantly from the brass nozzle, illuminating the stark, terrifying difference in their physical sizes. His fragile, scarred hands looked completely absurd holding the heavy industrial tool next to her dense, green musculature. You require a much heavier anchor to survive the violent recoil of this specific upgrade, he explained calmly over the roaring fire. He lifted the heavy dreadnought piston, maneuvering it carefully over the damaged brass plating of her mechanical forearm. The raw, jagged edges of the salvaged metal required immediate, intense fusing to the existing Syndicate cybernetics to function properly. He pressed the roaring blue flame of the welder directly against the thick iron joint. A violent shower of white-hot sparks instantly erupted outward into the freezing night air. The searing metal fragments bounced wildly off Vara's bare green skin and her heavily scarred collarbone. She sat completely still, not a single massive muscle twitching, fully trusting his intense, exhausted focus. The intense heat of the welding torch rapidly warmed the freezing air directly between them. Milo squinted painfully through his dark leather goggles, his small fingers maintaining a perfectly steady angle despite his deep, aching exhaustion. He remembered the brutal, unforgiving factories of his youth, where a single flawed weld meant a catastrophic boiler explosion and a dozen lost lives. He applied that exact same paranoid precision to the heavy brass valves, melting the rough edges together into a solid, impenetrable bond. Your reliance on my tiny tools goes directly against your arena training, he murmured softly, not breaking his deep concentration. In the fighting pits, exposing a vulnerability simply invites a faster execution, she answered, the heavy memory of white-hot branding irons evident in her flat tone. He killed the roaring flame, tossing the heavy torch carelessly onto the cold sand. Milo grabbed a heavy iron wrench and manually locked the primary pressure valves into place with a sharp, violent hiss of steam. The newly integrated dreadnought piston settled heavily against her thick forearm, adding a terrifying amount of raw, kinetic mass to her dark silhouette. The crude industrial modification lacked all the polished grace of the upper city artificers, looking exactly like a brutal weapon of desperate survival. He reached out tentatively with his bare, blistered hand, quickly testing the temperature of the cooling slag. "Flex the fingers," he commanded quietly, leaning back heavily on his aching heels. Vara sent a biological impulse straight through her unprotected nervous port. The massive siege piston engaged instantly, driving the heavy brass fingers into a tight, devastating fist with an ear-splitting metallic crack. The raw power output was completely staggering, easily capable of punching clean through solid iron armor plates. She slowly opened her hand, staring deeply at the incredibly lethal piece of scrap technology now permanently fused to her body. A person does not find their true strength in the pristine, sterile halls of their creators, but in the dirty, scarred hands of the one who pieces them back together. The quiet moment of victory suddenly shattered as the very ground beneath their boots began to vibrate with a deep, unnatural rhythm. The freezing ground shook violently. It was not the subtle, shifting tremor of loose desert sand settling in the dark, nor the gentle settling of old stone ruins. This was a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical pounding that resonated directly through the soles of Milo's worn leather boots. The brutal vibration traveled rapidly up his bad leg, settling deep into his aching bones. The deep vibrations carried the undeniable, terrifying signature of immense, moving iron. A Syndicate pursuit train was rapidly approaching their vulnerable position, acting as a relentless, moving fortress of black iron. Milo dropped to his bad knee beside the cold, smoking embers of their hastily built campfire. The escalating tremors traveled swiftly up the wooden spokes of their stolen cart. The aggressive shaking instantly knocked his fragile brass calipers, delicate screwdrivers, and tiny tension wrenches right off the cracked leather seat. The small, precise instruments tumbled helplessly into the abrasive red dirt, vanishing instantly in the darkness. A heavy, melancholic sigh escaped his chapped lips. He did not waste a single precious second attempting to dig through the frozen dirt to retrieve his livelihood. Survival in the lower slums taught a harsh, simple lesson. You abandon the fine details when the heavy executioner's hammer finally falls. He scrambled desperately toward the rear of the heavy smuggling vehicle, his weak lungs already burning in painful anticipation of the necessary exertion. The physical difference between the two runaways remained completely staggering in the chaotic moment. Vara rose slowly to her full, towering height, her massive silhouette effortlessly blotting out the pale moonlight. The newly integrated dreadnought piston hissed aggressively on her thick forearm, a heavy, deadly piece of machinery now permanently fused to her biological nervous system. The crude copper wiring glowed with a faint, angry heat against her dark green skin. She turned her broad, heavily scarred back toward the encroaching mechanical roar. Her yellow eyes narrowed into dangerous, predatory slits, scanning the jagged horizon. "They track the thermal signature of your careless welding torch, human," she growled loudly over the rising din. Her deep, gravelly voice lacked any trace of panic, carrying only the grim, exhausted resignation of a hunted beast. In the underground fighting pits, the loudest, most intimidating iron gates always opened just before the final, bloodiest execution round. A marked enforcer never expected a quiet, peaceful night in the wastelands. The thermal bloom from a single acetylene torch dissipates in exactly 3 minutes in this freezing wind, Milo shot back, his voice incredibly tight with rising tension. He leaned his frail weight heavily against the cold, iron-plated cargo bed. They did not track the heat. They followed the heavy, rhythmic, seismic footprint of this incredibly inefficient smuggling cart. The suspension is completely shot. He grabbed a heavy, rusted iron shovel from the tangled pile of scavenged scrap. The rough wooden handle was deeply splintered, stained with decades of old, dark grease. It slipped awkwardly in his small, trembling hands, feeling incredibly heavy compared to his lost, delicate tools. Vara simply braced her heavy, steel-toed boots into the shifting, abrasive sand. She actively prepared her massive, dense body to intercept the incoming kinetic force, entirely trusting her brutal instincts. "Then we stand and break their heavy front lines," she stated flatly, rolling her newly upgraded shoulder with a loud, satisfying mechanical clack. "I can tear the forward boiler plating off a pursuit engine if you disable the primary stabilizing treads." It was a completely insane, suicidal tactical proposal, born entirely from a lifetime of facing insurmountable, violent odds in a closed arena. "We do not fight a moving fortress with bare hands and a single wrench," Milo yelled back, entirely dismissing her gladiatorial logic. He desperately tossed heavy, jagged chunks of raw black coal directly into the dark, echoing maw of the cart's small furnace. He needed to build critical steam pressure immediately, or the massive pursuit train would flatten their fragile wooden chassis into bloody splinters without even slowing down. The chunks of coal were incredibly cold, biting sharply into his raw, blistered palms. He slammed the heavy cast-iron doors shut and cranked the primary bellows with his entire, meager body weight. A thick, suffocating cloud of black smoke instantly erupted from the rusted exhaust pipe. The toxic plume violently filled the cramped space beneath the canvas awning of the cart. Milo coughed violently, the bitter, chalky soot coating his dry throat and stinging his unprotected, watery eyes. He tasted the sharp, metallic flavor of raw sulfur on his tongue. "Get in the cart, Vara!" he shouted hoarsely between racking, painful coughs. His pale face was smeared completely with dark, greasy ash. He did not possess the immense physical strength to stop a speeding locomotive, but he understood the delicate, explosive science of pressurized steam better than any heavily armored Syndicate engineer. The massive female orc hesitated for a brief, critical second. Her deeply ingrained warrior code screamed at her to hold the bloody ground, to meet the incoming iron threat with raw, unyielding brawn. Yet she looked down at the fragile, soot-stained human frantically pumping the rusted bellows. He was actively destroying his own weak lungs just to get their only escape vehicle moving. She grabbed the heavy wooden side rail of the cart, pulling her immense weight into the cargo bed just as the ground completely erupted. The deafening roar of the approaching train grew terrifyingly loud, the aggressive mechanical sound completely swallowing the howling desert wind. The massive, black iron engine finally crested the jagged dunes behind them. Its brutal, blinding yellow searchlights cut violently through the swirling red dust, instantly illuminating their pathetic, small cart. A person can never truly outrun the heavy, crushing weight of a broken past. They can only shovel enough coal into the fire to stay exactly one desperate step ahead of the spinning wheels. The rusted pressure gauge on their dashboard suddenly screamed, the needle violently redlining just as a massive, steel-tipped harpoon shot from the train's front cannon directly toward them. The massive iron harpoon struck. The heavy projectile pierced the wooden frame of their fleeing cart with a deafening crack. The sheer kinetic impact of the massive train firing its weapons physically lifted the rear wheels entirely off the abrasive desert ground. A brutal, sickening jolt followed, dragging their small vehicle backward against the pulling force of its own overworked engine. Milo slammed his narrow chest hard against the cracked leather steering wheel, all the breath leaving his fragile lungs in a sudden gasp. The thick, spiked head of the Syndicate harpoon had embedded itself deeply into the solid oak crossbeam resting just inches behind his seat. The acrid smell of splintered, burning wood instantly filled the cramped space beneath the canvas awning. The heavy iron tether groaned, pulling them toward the grinding jaws of the black locomotive. The Syndicate designed these specific pursuit trains to break the spirit of fleeing exiles before breaking their bodies. The massive black engine was a moving fortress of riveted iron plates, radiating a terrifying heat that Milo could feel even from 50 yards away. The blinding yellow glare of its forward searchlights washed out all the color from the rusted wastes, turning the swirling dust into a chaotic fog. The deafening roar of its massive steam cylinders easily swallowed the pathetic cough of their stolen cart. The massive train was reeling them in like a helpless fish on a heavy line. Every single revolution of the train's winch violently shook the small cart, rattling Milo's aching teeth inside his pale skull. The physical contrast in their immediate reactions was absolute. Milo frantically scanned his rapidly dropping pressure gauges, his small, grease-stained hands desperately trying to find a mechanical advantage in the failing control panel. He possessed no martial skills to fight the heavy iron chain. Vara, however, did not look at the broken dashboard or the leaking copper pipes. The massive female orc lunged toward the rear of the cargo bed, directly confronting the tether. She grabbed the thick steel chains connecting the harpoon to the pursuit train and tried to snap the heavy links. Her broad green back corded with immense muscle as she planted her heavy boots firmly into the shifting floorboards. She let out a guttural roar, pitting her brutal biology against the relentless pull of a mechanical leviathan. The rusted chain pulled taut, humming with a deadly tension in the freezing night air. The newly installed dreadnought piston on her left arm hissed, locking its heavy pneumatic joints to anchor her massive weight. She applied enough raw force to rip an iron vault door off its hinges. Yet the brutal Syndicate steel of the tether resisted her power, the sharp edges cutting into the calloused flesh of her organic palms. Dark blood began to drip onto the shifting iron sand, rushing blindly beneath their spinning wheels. The underground arena had taught her to push harder until the opponent broke, but pure brawn rarely wins against heavily forged industrial iron. The sharp pain, radiating from her torn palms, triggered buried memories of the fighting pits. The cold iron of the chain felt like the heavy slave collars they used to drag her onto the bloody sands. Her mind instinctively equated the mechanical pull of the train with the cruel leash of her former masters. This psychological trauma forced her to grip the metal tighter, her broad knuckles turning bone white under the green skin. She was trapped in a mental loop, fighting a ghost of her past rather than the immediate reality of their tearing vehicle. Milo recognized the glassy stare of a combatant losing touch with the present moment. He knew he had to break her mental lock before the cart disintegrated beneath them. Milo felt the steering column shudder violently in his pale hands. The groaning noise of the straining wood was terrifying, sounding like a dying beast trapped under heavy rocks. He twisted his narrow torso around, his bad knee throbbing intensely as he looked back at the struggling warrior. Milo's screams over the roaring engines that the cart's wooden chassis is tearing apart. The heavy oak boards beneath Vara's boots were splintering, thick cracks racing along the main structural supports. If she managed to hold the heavy chain, the train would rip the entire back half of their stolen vehicle clean off, dragging them both under the massive iron treads. The physical deterioration of their stolen smuggling cart was happening fast. The vehicle was a patchwork monstrosity, held together by rusted iron brackets and desperate hope. The massive harpoon had compromised the main axle alignment. The left rear wheel began to wobble violently, kicking up blinding plumes of abrasive red dirt directly into their faces. The thick iron bands wrapping the wooden spokes shrieked against the rocky terrain, sending a shower of bright sparks into the dark night. Milo felt every agonizing bump radiate directly into his crippled leg, reminding him of his absolute physical frailty in this landscape of heavy iron and violence. "Let the chain go, Vara!" he yelled hoarsely, tasting bitter soot and fear on his dry tongue. "You cannot outpull a cast-iron boiler." The female orc bared her flat teeth, her yellow eyes wild with the cornered fury of a hunted gladiator. Relinquishing the grip meant surrendering to the pull, and her ingrained cultural code rejected submission. She ground her heavy boots deeper into the cracking floorboards, fresh blood smearing across the rusted chain links. "I will not yield ground to executioners," she roared back, the deep gravel of her voice cutting through the mechanical din. She needed to understand that a tactical retreat was not a shameful defeat, but a necessary calculation for mutual survival. Milo did not wait for her stubborn pride to yield. He abandoned the steering levers, trusting the deep ruts in the iron sand to keep the cart moving forward for exactly 10 more seconds. He reached under his grease-stained canvas apron, his small fingers wrapping securely around the cold handle of his iron wrench. A good mechanic knows exactly which load-bearing pin holds the fragile mechanism together. Sometimes the only way to save a burdened machine is to willingly break the part that is holding it back. The massive black train loomed dangerously close in the swirling red dust, its heavy cow-catcher ready to crush them into bloody scrap. Milo grabbed the steam core. It was an unstable, discarded piece of technology resting in the back of the cart, a volatile cylinder known to explode violently if mishandled. The heavy brass casing was freezing, biting sharply into his blistered palms as he hauled its mass upward. He dragged the cylinder slowly across the splintering floorboards, his ruined knee throbbing intensely with every backward step. The deafening roar of the Syndicate pursuit train directly behind them swallowed the howling desert wind, shaking the bones in his chest. They were running out of time, and the heavy harpoon chain connecting them to the locomotive was systematically tearing their fragile vehicle into splinters. He dropped the core near the cracked dashboard, the resulting impact rattling his scattered tools. He immediately used his iron wrench to forcefully strip the primary safety valves from the top casing. His grease-stained fingers worked with practiced speed, rapidly rewiring the pressure gauge to purposely overload the internal combustion chamber. It was a suicidal tactic in any engineering textbook, an act of sheer desperation born in the smog-choked alleys. If he miscalculated the fuse timing by a microscopic fraction of a second, the resulting blast would instantly vaporize them both. He tasted the bitter soot on his dry tongue, his heart hammering wildly against his narrow ribs. The internal pressure of the core began to rise terrifyingly fast, the brass casing groaning under the strain. Suddenly, the glass pressure dial cracked sharply, leaking a harsh spray of scalding steam directly onto Milo's unprotected wrists. He let out an involuntary hiss of agony, but he refused to pull his small hands away from the overheating metal. The blistering heat seared his pale skin deeply, a localized burn that contrasted heavily with the freezing night wind cutting across his hunched back. He forced his shallow breathing to slow down, focusing entirely on the trembling needle of the broken dial. A mechanic does not flinch when the overworked engine bites back. He simply tightens his grip on the wrench. "The chassis is failing, human!" Vara roared loudly over the mechanical din, her massive hands fighting the groaning harpoon chain. Her gravelly voice was raw with adrenaline and mounting exhaustion. "We have exactly 10 seconds before the rear axle snaps entirely, and we are dragged under the iron treads." Milo wiped a mixture of cold sweat and black grease from his pale forehead, ignoring the searing pain radiating from his scalded wrists. "I am building a localized pressure spike," he yelled back, his voice raspy from inhaling the toxic smoke. "I need you to throw exactly 100 pounds of unstable cast iron directly into their primary boiler." The female orc turned her scarred head, her yellow eyes locking onto the hissing steam core. The crude modification on her left arm hissed aggressively, the dreadnought piston priming for maximum kinetic output. Throwing a ticking bomb required absolute trust in the fragile human's volatile mathematics, a complete surrender of her ingrained gladiatorial instincts. In the underground fighting pits, you never relied on another combatant's weapon to secure your own survival. You trusted only your own thick fists. Yet, she looked down at his severely burned hands, recognizing the terrifying sacrifice he was making for their mutual escape. She deliberately released her bloody grip on the tearing harpoon chain, her heavy boots stomping forward across the shifting boards. She loomed entirely over his hunched form, her immense silhouette blotting out the blinding searchlights of the pursuing locomotive. The physical difference between them was staggering. The towering, heavily muscled warrior preparing to hurl death, and the small, crippled mechanic bleeding over the makeshift detonator. Milo twisted the final copper wire, sealing the catastrophic overload loop with a bright spark. The heavy brass cylinder began to scream, glowing a furious orange as the internal pressure reached critical mass. True destructive power does not reside in the heavy iron shell itself, but in the determined spark that willingly chooses to ignite it. "It is primed," Milo gasped breathlessly, falling backward heavily against the cracked leather seat, his burned hands shaking. Vara moved toward the screaming steam core. The brass casing glowed with a furious orange heat, threatening to rupture at any second. She ignored the blistering temperature. In the fighting pits, she had learned to block out the bite of a serrated blade to deliver a finishing strike. This was no different. She wrapped her heavy mechanical fingers around the cylinder. The newly integrated dreadnought piston vented a sharp puff of vapor, adjusting to the sudden, dense weight. The metal of her artificial palm seared against the bomb's surface, sending a spike of static feedback up her spinal port. She ground her teeth and lifted the core. The pursuing locomotive filled their entire field of vision. Its black iron grille resembled the lowered visor of an executioner. The yellow searchlights cast stark, moving shadows across the shifting dunes. Vara braced her boots against the cracked tailgate of the cart. The wood groaned under her mass. She focused her eyes on the open firebox of the train, a narrow square of roiling flames visible between the thick armor plates. It was a difficult target, rocking violently over the uneven terrain. She pulled her mechanical arm back. The internal gears locked into position. She waited for the precise moment the train crested a small dune, exposing the firebox fully. She triggered the spinal relay. The dreadnought piston deployed with a deafening crack. The kinetic force launched the unstable core directly into the swirling dust. The violent recoil threw Vara backward. Her shoulders slammed into the iron-plated side of the cargo bed, denting the metal inward. The glowing cylinder arced through the dark air. It slipped through the locomotive's iron grate and vanished into the blazing furnace. Milo gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2. The explosion turned the night into bright noon. A sphere of white-hot plasma expanded outward from the center of the train. The reinforced boiler plates sheared off, spinning into the desert like discarded coins. The shock wave hit the cart with the force of a solid wall. The impact shattered the windshield and ripped the canvas roof from its iron frame. The taut harpoon chain snapped, the tension releasing with a sharp, metallic whine. Freed from the anchor, the cart surged forward. The blast threw Milo against the dashboard. His chest struck the wood, forcing the air from his lungs. He slid off the leather seat, landing hard on his bad knee. Pain flared up his leg, a familiar ache. He curled into a tight ball on the floorboards, covering his head with his soot-stained hands as a rain of iron shrapnel clattered against the exterior armor. Behind them, the pursuit train died. The iron chassis derailed, the wheels tearing deep gouges into the sand. The momentum carried the ruined engine forward for another 100 yards before it collapsed onto its side. A secondary explosion blew the rear cargo doors open, spilling burning coal across the dunes. The screech of grinding metal slowly faded, replaced by the crackle of the raging fire. The smuggling cart rolled to a gradual stop. The overworked engine gave a final, rattling cough and seized completely. A thick cloud of gray smoke drifted through the shattered windows. Milo lay on the floorboards, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tasted copper and ash. He slowly pushed himself up, leaning on the steering column. His burned wrists throbbed with a steady rhythm. He looked through the empty windshield frame at the burning wreckage of the train. The threat was neutralized. The executioners were dead. He turned his head toward the back of the cart. Vara sat amid the splintered wood and twisted metal. Her chest heaved. The brass plating of her mechanical arm smoked lightly in the cold air. She looked at her intact hand, then at the burning train. The collar of the Syndicate was finally broken. She was no longer a hunted asset. She lowered her arm, the internal gears whining softly. The boiler pressure dropped, Milo said quietly, his voice raspy. He wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. "The target is destroyed," Vara replied. She did not yell. Her tone was flat, carrying the exhaustion of a long fight. She uncurled her fingers, letting a handful of iron sand fall through the gaps in the floorboards. Jagged iron rained from above. The sky turned into a deadly canopy of falling shrapnel. The massive explosion of the Syndicate pursuit train tore heavy armor plates into lethal, spinning blades. The resulting shockwave flipped their stolen steam cart violently onto its side, spilling Milo onto the freezing desert sand. He squeezed his eyes shut, raising his severely burned hands in a futile attempt to protect his fragile skull. He expected the crushing, final impact of heavy metal to end his miserable life in the dark. A massive shadow suddenly eclipsed the blinding fire. Vara threw her immense, dense body directly over his frail form. She planted her heavy boots firmly into the shifting dirt, forming a physical dome of green muscle and thick leather armor over the crippled mechanic. The newly upgraded dreadnought piston hissed loudly, locking her mechanical arms securely against the frozen ground to anchor their precarious position. The air filled completely with the sharp, deafening screeches of tearing metal and the chaotic thuds of heavy debris striking the earth. Milo pressed his pale cheek against the cold, abrasive sand. The suffocating heat of the burning locomotive washed over them in aggressive waves, but the immediate space beneath Vara felt incredibly safe. He felt the terrifying, heavy impacts of sharp iron debris striking her broad back. Each violent hit sounded exactly like a butcher's cleaver hacking into a solid oak block. She let out a low, guttural grunt with every heavy strike, but her towering frame did not yield a single inch. Warm biological blood dripped slowly from her shoulder onto his grease-stained canvas apron, creating a stark, terrifying contrast to the black machine oil covering his tools. In the underground factories of his youth, a ruptured steam pipe always meant a frantic, brutal stampede. Foremen ruthlessly trampled over young apprentices to reach the heavy iron blast doors, willingly leaving the weak to burn in the toxic fumes. Survival was always an isolated, selfish calculation in the lower slums. Yet this hunted gladiator, forged in the cruelest fighting pits of the sprawling city, actively chose to absorb lethal kinetic damage to shield a broken human. The heavy weight of that realization pressed into his chest much harder than the massive iron debris crashing around them. The deadly storm of shrapnel eventually ceased. The deafening roar of the primary explosion slowly faded into the crackling hiss of the burning wreck. Vara pushed herself slowly off the frozen ground, her heavy mechanical joints whining under the accumulated strain. "The sky is clear, Gear Boy," she grumbled, her deep voice rough with inhaled sulfur and toxic smoke. She did not offer a hand to help him up, honoring his need for basic physical dignity. Milo rolled painfully onto his back, his bad knee throbbing with a dull, familiar ache that radiated straight up his thigh. "You took direct hits to your primary subdermal armor," Milo observed quietly, noting the deep, bleeding gashes cutting entirely through her thick leather vest. The sharp edges of the Syndicate shrapnel had easily bypassed her hardened arena calluses. She wiped a dark smear of soot from her sharp jawline with the back of her organic hand. "Arena beasts hit much harder," she replied flatly, staring at the burning wreckage. She refused to acknowledge the pain, a deeply ingrained habit from a life where showing weakness meant an immediate, bloody execution. Milo dragged himself upright, using the tilted wooden chassis of their ruined cart for necessary support. The smuggling vehicle was a catastrophic wreck. The main wooden frame was splintered beyond any possible structural repair, and the rear iron axle lay twisted like a discarded copper wire. The heavy iron-banded wheels were deeply buried in the abrasive red dirt. He dusted off his thick leather welding goggles with his trembling, blistered fingers, carefully surveying the burning ruin of the Syndicate train resting in the jagged canyon. The massive black engine was completely gutted, Its thick, riveted boiler plates were peeled back violently like a rotten fruit, exposing the glowing, ruined internal combustion chambers. The volatile plasma from the overloaded steam core had effectively melted the heavy iron treads into useless pools of glowing, liquid slag. The oppressive, mechanical rhythm of the relentless hunters was permanently silenced, replaced entirely by the howling, freezing wind of the rust wastes. The air smelled strongly of melted brass, scorched flesh, and the cold, metallic tang of the desert. He limped slowly toward the massive female orc, pulling a clean, dry rag from his battered canvas pouch. He did not ask for verbal permission. He simply reached up and pressed the coarse cloth firmly against the deepest laceration on her broad shoulder. Vara tensed instantly, her yellow eyes flashing with a brief, instinctual flash of defensive anger, before she forced her heavy muscles to relax. She allowed the fragile human to tend to her bleeding wounds in the shadow of the burning iron fortress. A broken machine requires heat and a heavy hammer to forge anew. But a broken warrior requires only the quiet, steady presence of someone who chooses to stay. "We walk the rest of the way," Milo stated softly, looking out toward the jagged, dark horizon where the scrap fort supposedly lay hidden. Red dust coated their boots. The trek across the rust wastes took exactly 3 days of walking. Milo dragged his ruined leg through the abrasive iron sand, his stamina entirely depleted. The toxic air of the deep desert burned his throat with every inhalation. He leaned heavily on a splintered crutch salvaged from their ruined smuggling cart. Beside him, Vara moved with the measured pace of a veteran siege engine. Her immense frame blocked the biting crosswinds, offering him a silent, walking shelter. The harsh sun beat down on their exhausted bodies, baking the sweat into their skin. A massive structure finally broke the jagged horizon. It was the Scrap Fort, a legendary safe haven built by desperate exiles. The outer walls consisted of overlapping hull plates stripped from decommissioned dreadnoughts. Deep gouges covered the heavy iron barricades, serving as a grim testament to repelled Syndicate raids. The towering iron gates stood firmly shut against the howling wind. A small, fortified guard tower jutted from the main wall, manned by anonymous figures holding long rifles. Milo collapsed onto a flat slab of rusted iron, located 50 yards from the main entrance. His bad knee pulsed with a hot agony that traveled straight up his spine. He tossed his makeshift crutch onto the dirt, his frail chest heaving. Vara halted beside him, her silhouette casting a long shadow over his hunched form. In the underground fighting pits, a surviving gladiator always took a necessary moment to steady their breathing before entering a new cage. She sat down slowly on the frozen earth, crossing her muscular legs. Her upgraded mechanical arm rested heavily on her armored knee. The thick brass plating gleamed dully under the harsh sun, polished clean of the red dust by the constant friction of her leather cloak. The salvaged dreadnought piston hissed quietly, maintaining a stable internal pressure. It was a brutal modification, lacking the sterile elegance of the upper city clinics. Yet, it functioned with a terrifying reliability that perfectly suited the warrior. Milo pulled a small canvas pouch from his leather belt. His pale hands were covered in dark machine oil and red blisters from the exploding steam core. He extracted a tiny brass screwdriver, the metal tool feeling cold against his burned skin. He leaned awkwardly toward her towering form, his weak leg protesting the sudden shift in posture. He needed to secure the primary tension spring before they entered the bustling settlement. He did not ask for verbal permission to touch her lethal weaponry. Vara completely relaxed her scarred shoulder. She willingly surrendered the vulnerable mechanical joint to his trembling fingers. Milo slotted the microscopic tip of the screwdriver into the final brass screw located near her wrist actuator. He twisted the tool with deliberate slowness, feeling the underlying copper gears lock into their correct alignment. The physical contrast remained absolutely staggering. His fragile wrist hovered directly over her dense musculature, easily broken by a single twitch of her hand. He applied a final fraction of torque, securing the heavy iron plating permanently to the internal biological relays. Milo let out a ragged exhale, dropping the tiny tool back into his dark pouch. He reached up with his left hand, dragging a coarse rag across his pale forehead to wipe away a thick layer of cold sweat and black engine grease. The fabric left a dark, smeared trail across his exhausted features. He slumped back against the rusted iron slab, staring blankly at the towering walls. "The internal alignment is perfectly stable," Milo stated quietly, his voice raspy from severe dehydration. "The dreadnought piston draws power directly from your spinal port without causing catastrophic neural lag." Vara turned her heavy head, her yellow eyes studying the intricate copper wiring bridging her living flesh to the dead iron. She flexed her brass fingers again, the metal joints clicking with a smooth precision. She remembered the blinding heat of the Syndicate branding irons, the cruel tools used to mark her as disposable property. This touch was entirely different. "The Syndicate overseers possessed pristine laboratories," Vara rumbled, her deep voice vibrating through the cold desert air. "They utilized pure silver wire and perfectly calibrated steam presses. Yet their expensive mechanisms always failed during a prolonged engagement." She ran her organic thumb over the rough weld Milo had hastily applied in the freezing dark. "Your crude iron patch holds firm. You employ terrible aesthetics, Gearboy." It was not a harsh insult, but a profound observation from a warrior who strictly valued survival over appearance. Milo offered a weak, melancholic smile, keeping his weary eyes fixed on the distant gates. "The city artificers view a broken machine as a complete failure," he replied slowly, picking at a loose thread on his canvas apron. "They simply discard the flawed mechanism and forge a brand new component. They do not understand the inherent value of heavy stress." He gestured vaguely toward her massive, heavily scarred bicep. "A repaired fracture always heals thicker. A welded iron joint holds far more kinetic tension than a freshly cast plate." Vara processed the quiet philosophy, her sharp mind translating the mechanical logic into the brutal reality of her own scarred biology. The city threw her into the bloodiest arenas because they considered her a broken beast. The corrupt Syndicate weaponized her trauma, turning her into a numb executioner. Yet this limping human looked at her violent history and saw only a strong foundation ready for a necessary rebuild. He chose mercy over the expected cruelty of their world. She reached out with her heavy mechanical hand. She did not form a lethal fist or draw her scuffed pistol. Vara gently rested her thick brass fingers against the thin fabric of his grease-stained shoulder. The heavy metal felt surprisingly warm, heated entirely by the steady pulse of her biological nervous system. It was a gruff, silent acknowledgement of their shared survival. Milo did not flinch away from the terrifying weight. He closed his exhausted eyes, finally allowing himself to rest before they walked together toward the heavy iron gates.